I'll begin with a story that is not the essence of what I'm going to say. John came into the kitchen where his mother was making dinner. His birthday was coming up, and he thought it was a good time to tell his mother what he wanted. "Mom, I would like a bike for my birthday." Now, John had been a bit of a troublemaker at home and in school. He'd gotten into trouble. So John's mother asked him if he thought that he deserved to get a bike for his birthday. John said, of course he thought that he did deserve the bike. John's mother, being a Christian woman, wanted him to reflect on his behavior over the past year and write a little letter to God and tell him why he deserved a bike for his birthday. Little John stomped up the stairs to his room, sat down to write a letter to God. Letter number 1. Dear God, I have been a very good boy this year, and I would like a bike for my birthday. Make it a red one. Your friend, John. Now, John knew this wasn't true. He had not been a very good boy over the years, so he tore up this letter and he started over again. Letter number 2. Dear God, this is your friend, John. I have been a pretty good boy this year, and I would like a red bike for my birthday. Thank you, John. Now, John knew this wasn't true either, so he tore up the letter and he started a third time. Letter number 3. Dear God, I know I haven't been a very good boy this year, and I am sorry. I will be a good boy if you will just give me a red bike for my birthday. Thank you, John. John knew, even if this was true, this was probably not going to get him his bicycle. By now, he was very upset. He went downstairs and he told his mother that he wanted to go to church. Now, John's mother thought her plan had worked because John looked very sad. She said, just be home in time for dinner. So John walked down the street to the church, up to the altar. He looked around to see if there was anyone there. He picked up a statue of the Virgin Mary, slipped it under his shirt, and ran from the church. Ran home, through the front door, up the stairs, into his room, closed the door, and he began to write his 4th letter to God. Letter 4. I've got your mother. If you ever want to see her alive again, send the bike. Signed, you know who. The subject this morning is our children. Some people think apologetics is the difficult subject. No. Children, that's the difficult subject. And at a time when so many young people are growing up to walk away from God and to walk away from His church, I want to ask the question, how do we raise our kids to love God? How do we raise our kids to want to continue with God as they grow? Well, before we ask this question, we really need to ask a prior question, because evangelization is about communication, first of all. And if we're going to communicate, hope to communicate with our kids, if we're going to connect with them, then we need to understand what they care about. And so I want to ask the question first, what do our kids care about? And I don't mean individually, because individually our kids are very different from one another, and they care about all kinds of things. I'm asking the question, as created in the image and likeness of God, as human persons, what do our children care about? What do they care most about? What does every person care about, both you and your children? What is the common ground, in other words, that we share, all of us, together? Well, scratching my head in search for an answer to this question, I was reading one of the more popular books on Christian child rearing. It's written by the 17th century Catholic philosopher Blaise Pascal. You won't find it on the shelf next to James Dobson, but it's fantastic work. In his work called The Pensées, The Thoughts, he answers this question of what we all care about with these words. Listen. All men seek happiness. There are no exceptions. Whatever different means they may employ, they all tend to this end. This is the motive of every act of every person, even of those who hang themselves. What is it then that this desire proclaims to us, but that there was once in man a true happiness, of which there now remains in him only the mark and the empty trace? which he in vain attempts to fill from his surroundings, seeking from things absent, things he doesn't have, what he does not receive from things present, from the things that he does have. But all of these are inadequate, because the infinite abyss within us can only be filled by an infinite object, that is to say, only by God himself. Now, when I first read this back in seminary 20 years ago, I knew instantly that it was true. I could look back on my life and I recognized instantly my life amounted to one long, serious quest for happiness. And whatever means I had employed along the way, and God knows I employed a lot of means, this was my quest. This was my one motive and my one goal in everything that I did. It was not a search for truth, first of all. My search was a search for something, or more precisely, a search for someone who could fill this infinite abyss that Pascal is talking about. This passage, in fact, became sort of a theme for me, theologically and spiritually. And so when I became a Catholic 15 years later, and I opened my Catholic catechism, I was happily surprised. More than that, I was thrilled to realize that the Catechism of the Catholic Church begins with precisely the same truth. In fact, in part 1 of your catechism, chapter 1, section 1, paragraph 1, this is what we read. The desire for God is written on the human heart, because man has been created by God and for God, and God never ceases to draw a man to himself. Only in God will he find the truth and the happiness he never stops searching for. Now understand, this applies to every person on earth. It applies to you. It applies to me. Every living soul, including our children. Including our children. And I want you to think of your kids for a moment. How many of your kids, seriously, how many of your kids are on a quest for truth? How many of your kids are consumed day and night with the desire to construct a philosophically coherent worldview? Put up your hands. I want to see. Not one? Now, how many of your kids are on a quest for happiness? This is more practical than you might think. A sociologist some years back asked the question, why are so many young people leaving the church? And he was referring to the Catholic Church, but it would apply really to all versions. He interviewed them, and guess what he found? This is striking. He found that 2% of those young people growing up in the church who left the church, only 2% did so because they said they had spiritual needs that were not being met in the church. Only 2. 19% of those questioned had left the church because they were engaged in behavior. They were living a lifestyle that they knew was at odds with the teaching of Christianity. 19%. 23% of those who left did so because they just simply didn't relate. They didn't relate to the Catholic Church, and so they walked. But 52%, listen to this, 52%, more than all of the other categories combined, said that they left the church because their family situation as they were growing up was an unhappy situation. And therefore, in order to get away from an unhappy upbringing, they left the religion of their upbringing. 52%. So what can you and I as parents do? There are a million answers to this question. I've attempted to put together something that is coherent today, and I want to simply give you, in fairly quick succession, 6 admonitions for you parents today. With these truths in mind, with this truth of Pascal and the Catechism, this issue of happiness, the results of this sociological survey, admonition number 1, we want to love our kids. We want to love one another in our families. We want to provide a home and a family that our children, as they grow up and as they leave, will remember with happiness. That they'll remember with fondness. love and affection. Now, if any of you know me, you know, those of you who know me, a couple, you know that I'm a lover of learning myself. And if this were up to me, I might be tempted to say the number one thing is we need to be educating our kids in Catholic theology and in apologetics. But then, I think back to my own life. When I was very young, I went to church for a short time between the ages of 10 and 12. That was really it. I don't remember a single lesson that I ever heard. I don't remember any theology. I don't remember any apologetics. The thing that stands out, the one thing I remember is going to a winter camp when I was probably 11 years old, a junior high winter camp. There was a young man there that was the counselor in our cabin, and 35 years later, I remember his name. His name was Roger. And what I remember, Roger cared about me. He asked me some questions. He paid a little bit of attention to me. And this is only in the course of a 3-day camp. And I was so moved by that I wanted to be exactly like Roger. I remember hightailing it down to the Christian bookstore there at the camp because, he read Christian books. I wanted to do it now, too. I wanted to be like him. So I was just fishing around on the bookshelves. I knew nothing about Christian literature. So I picked up a book that looked interesting by C.S. Lewis called The Screwtape Letters. And if any of you have read that book, you will realize, God knows, I had no idea what Mr. Lewis was up to in that book. At 11 years old, sitting out in the forest reading it, all I cared about is that I wanted to be like Roger. I wanted to love God. I wanted to be like him because he loved me. And when I think back on that, I realize that I want my son and I want my daughter to remember me all their lives as someone who loved them. And this is not always easy to do, I understand. It's not always easy to do. It's not easy to have a happy home and a loving home. As I was preparing this talk, in fact, I was weighed down all week because in some ways, in some serious ways, our life as a family became difficult when I left the Protestant ministry to become Catholic. Because when I was a Baptist minister, we lived in this little cocoon, as it were. It was the kids, and it was Tina and I, and we had good friends there in our church, great friends. And my profession was secure. My income was secure. I knew that I could preach at that church until the day that I died. I never even thought about whether or not I was getting a paycheck. It was just appeared magically in my mailbox every 2 weeks. Then when I became a Catholic, I had to walk on that. And in the end, I ended up getting a 100% commission job. At times I've done well with it, but when you're working 100% commission, you're always a little bit nervous. You're not sure whether the money's going to come in, and so Tina and I end up talking more about finances. We end up at times worrying more about it. Our family was divided spiritually because of my conversion and Tina and I converting. There were difficult things that happened, and there are other stresses that have entered the picture too. And so I understand it is not always easy. It's not always easy to maintain a loving home and to have a home that you could describe as a happy, a peaceful home, the kind of home your children will remember with nothing but fondness. But this is what we need to strive for. This is what we want, to build a home that our children will remember with happiness.